It was 1965. The Beatles were top of the pops. An American astronaut had walked in space, and the world-famous photographer, Tony Snowdon, and his wife, Princess Margaret, were touring America.
The reaction was tremendous. When they landed, the Beatles had been there not such a long time before, and they were met by the same cheering crowds, the same volume of people lining the tops of buildings at the airport. Here you've got this pop idol couple.
Tony Snowdon was one of the most flamboyant figures of the 60s. Charming, charismatic, trend-setting, talented.
He's one of Britain's best photographers, without a doubt. Quite amazing photographs, not just the formal portraits he's well known for, but the reportage, the fashion, it's all there.
Princess Margaret was the Diana of her day.
Well, I think the whole thing was a fairy story, and fairy stories come to an end.
The Snowdons' 18-year marriage crashed to an end in 1978. Theirs was the first royal divorce for over 400 years and caused shockwaves. At the time, Tony came out on top, and Princess Margaret was blamed for the failure of the marriage and embarrassing the royal family.
It was hard because she wasn't really able to say her side of it. I think Tony had certainly been carrying on with his own life and his own friends in a way that made her humiliated.
The marriage was doomed from the start. Tony's twin obsessions of sex and work left little room for his wife's needs.
Loads of his friends have told me and described to me his great sexual appetite. In fact, one of his friends remarked to me, "If it moves, he'll have it."
Tony Snowdon made the royal family seem sexy, glamorous and modern. But complex and unconventional, he couldn't survive in Margaret's traditional world. Now, for the first time, his friends and family set the record straight about the man, his relationship with Princess Margaret, and his secret love child, born during one of the most tempestuous royal marriages of recent times. The engagement of the photographer Anthony Armstrong-Jones to Princess Margaret was announced on the 26th of February 1960.
Everyone in Britain and the Commonwealth wholeheartedly wishes long years of happiness to the Princess and her fiancé.
Privately, those who knew the couple were horrified. Tony's friend Jocelyn Stevens sent him a telegram saying, "Never was there a more ill-fated assignment."
He knew that Tony liked the bohemian kind of life, and he was worried that their two different lives might not get on very well after a certain amount of time because they came from two such completely different backgrounds.
Tony was an upper-class rebel who'd spent his 20s pushing the boundaries of sex, race and class to the limits. Princess Margaret was the sister of the Queen, who'd grown up in a gilded cage.
She could be incredibly grand and very royal, and even, dare one say, very spoilt. But I do believe she was always a little girl looking for love.
Princess Margaret was the product of a stable family background, the adored favourite of her father, George VI. Tony was a boy from a broken home, who'd grown up feeling rejected by his beautiful mother, Anne. She divorced his father, Ronald Armstrong-Jones, when Tony was only 5.
For Tony, that probably was extremely difficult. Anne no longer had the time to be the devoted mother to him.
Tony's mother was image-conscious, artistic, and deeply socially ambitious. Soon after her divorce, she remarried, this time to an Irish peer, the Earl of Ross. Now the mistress of a huge castle in Ireland, she introduced Tony as her ugly son. He and his sister Susan were set aside in favour of his half-brothers, the son and heir Brendan and his brother Martin.
When they travelled on the train, Brendan would be given a little carriage all to himself, but he wasn't allowed to sit where other people sat. The whole place had to be covered with white linen sheets on the walls and on the chairs, and he would be able to sit there alone with his nurse, first class. Martin was allowed to travel second class, and Tony and Susan would travel third class.
Family members believe this rejection had a profound effect on Tony's character.
It drove an ambition in him to prove himself worthy of her love. And I think that went on all his life, right up till her death. He was very fond of her and wanted to seek her love and approval.
The other formative experience of Tony's childhood was being struck down by polio when he was 16. But even then, his mother wasn't there for him.
I'm afraid Anne, I don't think, visited him once in hospital.
Faced with the prospect of being a permanent invalid, Tony forced himself to walk again.
He was lucky to survive. He realised how lucky he was, although it seriously affected one of his legs. It actually left one of his legs slightly shorter than the other. We realised how lucky we were not to have lost a brother altogether.
As if to prove himself, Tony became super active, rowing, shooting, skiing, riding motorbikes. In 1950, he coxed the Cambridge 8 to victory in the boat race.
Polio gave Tony that added spur and ambition, passion to succeed in whatever he did, and proved that he was not just equal to other people, but better than other people.
But there's no fooling about the superiority of the men from Cambridge.
Tony's drive and determination would bring him professional success and a glittering marriage. But his constant desire for new experiences, combined with his feelings of rejection by his mother, would make him rebellious, promiscuous, and at times callous and destructive. A challenging choice for a vulnerable princess. Princess Margaret's future husband, Anthony Armstrong-Jones, always insisted on being called the familiar Tony. He began working as a photographer in 1950, when he was 20. On the surface, he was charming, attention-seeking, and given to slightly cruel practical jokes.
He was very impish, and he had this wicked smile, and of course he was incredibly attractive. And he was small, but you never realised that he was small, because he had this great personality.
Although Tony's mother didn't think photography a suitable career for her son, he exploited his impeccable social contacts and started off taking society pictures. But he quickly developed his own radical style, as his friend and fellow photographer Bob Belton remembers.
He didn't pose people very carefully. He just kept snapping and snapping, and he said to me, "You should get up close with your camera," and really up. And I said, "Well, I can't. I find it intrusive." And he said, "Well, that's what being a photographer is all about."
In the mid-50s, Tony pioneered a revolution in theatrical photography. Rejecting conventional studio portraits, he prowled around rehearsals, taking informal shots.
And Tony had this unbelievable gift of making it like a photographed conversation. You were just unaware of him taking pictures. He was fun to be with. He always made you feel that you were the most important person that he wanted to talk to.
Tony had been introduced to the theatre world by his mother's brother, the designer Oliver Messel, photographed here by Cecil Beaton in one of his own creations.
Oliver took on the role of a father to some extent, and Oliver was able to inspire Tony. He helped him in every possible way.
In theatrical circles, it was widely known and accepted that Oliver Messel was gay.
He wasn't sort of girly camp. He was sort of like a camp monkey, with his bright boot-button eyes and dark hair and a smile. But he wasn't sort of get you camp.
What's that mean?
Well, that was like that they used to do it those days.
Tony was saturated in Oliver's creative world, where everyone was darling. But when one of Tony's more conventional friends, Anthony Barton, went to dinner with Uncle Oliver, he found the Messel setup slightly alarming.
I suppose I was maybe rather old-fashioned and everything, but I thought it rather strange that the staff, the male staff, all came around and kissed everybody, including the guests, including me. I wasn't quite sure that was what I was expecting, but it was one thing to be kissed by Oliver Messel, but another thing to be kissed by the staff.
Homosexuality was illegal in the 1950s, but Tony anticipated the 60s in his defiance of conventional sexual attitudes and willingness to camp it up, as in this photograph of him taken on holiday in Italy.
Certainly saw him with a lot of bisexual and homosexual people.
Several of his assistants, his photographic assistants, the girls in his studio in earlier days, thought that he himself was like that.
Rejecting the society world of his mother, Tony embraced the wild side of life. He took pictures of seedy parts of London, like this joint in Canning Town, which he explored with an old friend from Eton, Andy Garnett.
I think he had a taste for louche high life, in that he enjoyed the loucheness, particularly when it was associated with high life.
There was a really funny story about Tony coming back early in the morning at about 5 o'clock on a bus, and he'd been to a rather grown-up fancy dress party, and he was sitting on the bus with all these old dears who were going off to clean offices and things with their headscarves on, and there was Tony sitting dressed from top to toe in black leather with a whip.
Highly sexed, Tony was also a magnet for women, and in his line of work had plenty of opportunities for casual encounters. In the 1950s, his love life was the kind of sexual free-for-all which for most people didn't kick in until the late 60s.
There was a constant succession of girlfriends, and loads of his friends have told me and described to me his great sexual appetite. In fact, one of his friends remarked to me, "If it moves, he'll have it."
Tony didn't just go after society beauties. In the mid-50s, he caused a stir in upper-class circles when he started dating a Chinese girl from Trinidad, actress and rising star Jacqueline Chan.
She was exotic, you see, because we hadn't seen many Chinese. We hardly knew what China was. I think he was ahead of his time. There weren't many Chinese girls around to have affairs with. But that's quite sort of typical of his unconventionality, I think, was having a Chinese girlfriend.
Jackie was the first real love of Tony's life, but she was just one of many girlfriends. What no one has known until now is how Tony, restless and elusive, was running several women at the same time. At the end of 1957, he photographed a stunning 18-year-old debutante, Gina Ward.
They clicked instantly, and they did have this really passionate affair, and she fell deeply in love with him.
This was the man, reckless, promiscuous, creative, secretive and unconventional, who in February 1958 went to a dinner party and met Princess Margaret, one of the most eligible women in the world.
She thought he was jolly amusing, and she told me afterwards that she didn't think he was interested in women, so wasn't too sure that they would ever meet up again.
Princess Margaret was at a vulnerable point. 28, she was recovering from a long love affair with group captain Peter Townsend. They'd wanted to marry, but he was divorced, and in the 1950s, divorce was a scandal. Margaret had finally said publicly that she couldn't marry Townsend because Christian marriage was indissoluble.
When she issued this statement saying that mindful that Christian marriage is indissoluble, these were not just words on a piece of paper. They were heartfelt because, above all, Princess Margaret was incredibly religious.
At the time she met Tony, Princess Margaret took her religion so seriously, she was involved in a prayer group. But the public saw only the glamour.
I do remember an editor of a newspaper saying to me that the two most sought-after women to photograph in the world at that particular time were Elizabeth Taylor and Princess Margaret.
One of her many admirers wanted a picture of her, Who better to take it than Tony? This time, a sexual spark was lit. Tony started secretly dating Princess Margaret and introduced her to a new world, offbeat and edgy. He took her to his studio in a scruffy part of Pimlico. He entertained her in a room he kept in a converted pub in Rotherhithe, in the London docks.
I think that she thought she was having a taste of real bohemian life, and I think that gave her pleasure.
But Princess Margaret had no idea just how wild her new boyfriend was, and she didn't know that as a result of his troubled relationship with his mother, he had never been a one-woman man.
It may seem strange that while he was falling deeply in love with Princess Margaret, he was still carrying on with Jackie Chan and Gina Ward. But I don't think that sexual fidelity has ever been a keynote of Tony's character.
Two people in on the secret of Tony's royal romance were his friends, Jeremy and Camilla Fry.
They were sort of bohemian early on. They were the first 50s, 60s people.
Jeremy had been a regular at Tony's studio. Both of them were inventors.
He was the meaning of the word charisma. He was astonishing. He got green eyes. If he wanted you to do something, he would pin you against the wall behind you and fixing his eyes on you.
Jeremy Fry was bisexual, enormously attractive to both men and women. Jeremy was one of the most important figures in Tony's life. He was probably his dearest friend.
In 1955, Jeremy had married Camilla Grinling, one of Tony's many ex-girlfriends, who'd remained a close friend.
Tony, I know, loved going to stay with them, and it was a very important part of his life. I think he was happier there. They were, I think, definitely his favourite friends.
In the autumn of 1959, Tony went to stay several times with the Frys, without Princess Margaret, with consequences that would only be revealed years later.
During these weekends, they went in for a kind of experimentation that became fairly standard among certain sets in the 60s. Quite a lot went on there. Of course, Tony and the Frys, they were very much at the cutting edge, very avant-garde, and so a lot went on. They took quite a lot of alcohol. The result was that, really, inhibitions were fairly readily shed. They were all extremely close. Tony was still extremely fond of Camilla, and when inhibitions are shed, latent attraction always comes to the fore. Camilla and Tony were still deeply fond of each other, and at some point, it appears, they became lovers again.
Tony wasn't just having a fling with Camilla. There was also Gina and Princess Margaret. Never predictable, this was the moment he chose to make a commitment and propose to the Queen's sister. Deeply in love, she wanted a stable marriage like her parents and sisters. But she was pinning all her hopes of future happiness on an emotionally insecure serial seducer.
She wrote to her lady-in-waiting saying that I'm engaged to the most heavenly man. We're so happy it's unbelievable.
Over dinner at their London house, Tony broke the news of his engagement to his family.
We were, I think, each so stunned that it was very difficult to find words, because it came as such an amazing surprise that no words came easily. So Tony naturally said, "Goodness, I thought you'd be pleased."
Tony's mother, of course, Lady Ross, was thrilled with the engagement. It was the fulfilment of her wildest social dreams, and of course she was all over Tony then. He was showered with her approval.
Before the official announcement, the bridegroom had to tie up a few loose ends from his previous lives. He told Jackie Chan and his girlfriend, Gina Ward, that he was engaged. Then he arranged to see Tom Parr, one of his gay friends, to check whether any photographs he'd taken of them on holiday could be misinterpreted.
It was only when the engagement was announced that Tom Parr realised that he was looking through them just in case there was anything sort of possibly compromising in them that he had to know about.
Tony and Princess Margaret's first outing as a newly engaged couple was to the opera. Behind the scenes, a worried friend asked her whether she realised what a handful Tony would be.
She said, "He's bohemian. He won't always be home for dinner. You won't always know where he is. You won't always know what he's doing. You won't always be there. Can you cope with that?" And the princess, flushed of course with love, said, "Yes, that's fine, of course I can cope with it."
The couple were cheered when they appeared in public, but privately, the old guard at Buckingham Palace were concerned. One told a friend, "The boy Jones has led a very diversified and sometimes a wild life, and the danger of scandal and slander is never far off." Almost immediately, the palace's fears were confirmed. Tony wanted his closest friend, Jeremy Fry, to be his best man. But the courtiers discovered that in 1952, Jeremy had been fined £2 for importuning in Hyde Park.
He'd been arrested for beguiling guardsmen, if that's the word, and in the park. And so there was a big hoo-ha about it.
In 1960, a bisexual best man was not on at a royal wedding. It was announced that Jeremy Fry was ill. Tony's new best man was the distinguished neurologist and old friend of Princess Margaret's, Dr. Roger Gilliatt.
I think he was very surprised to be asked, yes, very surprised. I think quite a lot of people were quite surprised, including Roger.
A princess of unique personality, gay, intelligent, compellingly human, was marrying the man of her own choice.
Tony and Princess Margaret were married in Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May 1960.
Groom and best man came towards their places. Already in hers was the Countess of Ross, Mr. Armstrong Jones's mother. The best man was Dr. Roger Gilliatt.
The public were thrilled that the troubled princess was marrying for love. Meanwhile, Andy Garnett, who was keeping the banished Jeremy Fry company, took a different view.
What I did think about was his courage. You know, first of all, the royal family and all their various bodyguards of elderly men and elderly disapproving women. And next, the idea of walking up the nave of Westminster Abbey with umpteen million people staring at him on their TVs. And then spending his honeymoon on a ship with 350 horny matelots. If that doesn't call for courage, I really don't know what does.
To the delight of everybody,
in the early days of the marriage, Tony gave up work and kept his wild maverick side under wraps. He walked several paces behind his wife, kept his mouth shut, and tried to fit in with Princess Margaret's world of rigid protocol.
At the college, Her Royal Highness presented the Queen's Sword to Midshipman Wallace, watched by her husband, to whom the royal round of engagements is still very new.
I think it tickled his fancy, I should think, to be married to Princess Margaret. He acted as if he enjoyed it. I think he enjoyed all the social thing, and he enjoyed all the people around, and he enjoyed the precedence.
Friends noticed the sexual chemistry between the couple.
They were obviously in love, and everybody could see it, that they were together all the time. They moved together to whatever side of the room. They stuck together very closely.
It was like an electric current. They were very tactile, they're very touching and loving and all the rest in a way that had really not been expected, I suppose, of a royal couple before.
Their first child, David, was born on the 3rd of November 1961.
See Viscount Linley, aged 4 weeks, in the arms of his beautiful mother.
Initially reluctant to take a title, Tony had relented and became the Earl of Snowdon. He was a devoted father to his 2 children.
He always treated them, the moment they could walk and talk a bit, like grown-ups, which children actually love, I think. And so he always made, whatever he did with them, he made them interested. He explained how it worked, showed them how to make or mend things. And he was very, very good with his children.
The Snowdons appeared to have everything, including a beautiful home in Kensington Palace which Tony designed himself. But none of this was enough for him.
His friend Jocelyn Stephen said it must have been like a pilot, giving up his career for his marriage, but looking up at every aircraft flying by and thinking, I should be up there.
After only 2 years, Tony wanted to escape the royal treadmill. In 1962, the Sunday Times scored a major coup and secured the services of one of Britain's top photographers.
Assignment number 1 for pressmen, a picture of Lord Snowdon arriving at the Sunday Times.
Over the years, Tony would produce a vast range of iconic work. His inability to stand still would bring him huge success. But the same forces would ultimately destroy his marriage. The demons which had driven him as a young man were neither dead nor buried.